My name is Daniel Thompson. On May 11th, 2022, I took the day off from work and I wanted to surprise my wife because she always complained about the garage being dirty. I cleaned the garage from top to bottom, organized it, and had it ready for my wife to come home. I put some good gospel music in the garage where she'll drive into a very clean, organized garage, and she'll be grateful that I took care of that honey-do list that she had given me to ensure the garage is nice and clean. Well, as I was sitting upstairs waiting for her to drive into the garage, I received a phone call. I didn't pick it up because I assumed it was a robocall from one of the local counties in the area. And the call came in immediately again, and I did not pick up. But it came in the third time, back to back. So I thought I needed to pick it up to see who this was. And when I picked it up, there was a gentleman on the other end, said, Mr. Thompson, this is Officer Dixon from the Houston County Sheriff Department. And he asked me, how did I know Alvita Thompson? And I shared that's my wife. And he asked, what would she be doing in the area of Gun Road? That's where she's on her way home. That's just a few miles down the road. She should be here in a few minutes. He said, well, I need to let you know there was an accident that your wife was in, and it was a very severe accident. I want to send a police car to pick you up. I said, well, is she okay? She said, well, right now she's unconscious. We've got her out the car into EMS. She's not conscious, but she's been hurt really bad and we don't know the outcome. The EMS had mentioned to him that they didn't think she would make it because she had her blood pressure was, her oxygen was very low and they couldn't get a pulse and so forth. And she was completely covered with blood from the accident. There was a lot of questions I wanted to ask, but I did not because I was just floored because my expectation was her to drive into the garage, not to get a call from an officer that she was involved in an accident. So my mind thought the worst. I didn't get any details, but I told him, no, don't send a car to pick me up. And I knew that was bad also. I said I would drive to the trauma center because it was going to Navicent, which is in Macon, Georgia. I jumped in my car and I took off. I tried to get there as fast as I can without bringing too much attention to myself, but I was going at a high rate of speed trying to get there. But driving there, my eyes watered so bad from crying and tears, and that a fear tried to come over me that I couldn't see. I literally could not see because of the tears in my eyes. And I drove and I drove and I prayed and asked the Lord to help me and give me strength. I kept wiping my eyes as fast as I could. And I drove over to the trauma center. I went to the ER and when I arrived, and they stated that the EMS had just arrived, but they would not allow me to go back. So I paced up in the front, kept going back and forth, trying to get them to give me some information on my wife, but she had just got there, so they didn't have any information to give me at the moment. Just told me to stand by. But there was a gentleman there. He was a National Guard guy. He was still in uniform, and he was working there in the emergency room at the trauma center. And he eventually came to me after I was there probably about 45 minutes trying to get some information on my wife to take me back. He said, well, now I've seen your wife, and he said she was beat up pretty bad, which I thought was a bad selection of words for him to tell me that. But he did take me back to the ER and I saw my wife. When I walked into the ER, I looked and I really didn't know how I felt because who and what I was looking at did not look like my wife. She was completely covered with blood. Her face was swollen twice, if not 3 times the size that it is. Her eyes was black and shut. She had a knot in the lower part of her forehead that protruded away from her forehead almost 2 inches. It was huge. There was a slit in her forehead that came out of her hairline down her forehead that was just constantly bleeding. And she was still unconscious. And I just fell to the floor and just started screaming and crying out to the Lord for intervention because it really did not look good. But we prayed, and I went in the corner and I called the Mingers, and I shared with them that it was an accident. I didn't have any details. I just said, pray for God's intervention, that she would come around and she would be okay. And they began to pray. And I was going to call the other prayer warriors. We have a circle of friends that we normally call when we want to go into battle. But I was led in my spirit to call someone else. And I called my small group out of Word of Faith. And oh Lord, they began to pray and send me text messages and encouraging messages during this time. But I was just in a corner praying. But eventually my wife woke up. And when she got her consciousness, she just screamed in pain. That it just pierced me. But there was nothing I can do. I just stood there and kept praying. I wanted to help her, but I couldn't help her. There's nothing I can do. And I called for the nurse, and they said, well, Mr. Thompson, we can't give her pain medication because her oxygen level is too low. The pain medication make it lower, and it will not be good. Her blood pressure is still extremely low. There's nothing we can do except make her comfortable. But she screamed and she yelled, her back. At the time, she was in a neck brace, and they had a back brace on her, and they had tubes all inside of her. Oh, wow. And it was just a place that God had taken me to where I can do nothing. But then I said, Lord, you said that when I am weak, you are strong. So I just stood there and said, now there's nothing I can do, so it is all in your hands. So I stood there on faith, and I just kept crying out to the Lord and believing she's going to be okay. Remove the pain. I expected a miracle just then to give her comfort. And for hours, she cried and she cried. And her back was hurting. We could not move her. They took her out to x-rays. They took her out to scans and kept bringing her back. And eventually, her oxygen level got up late that evening, and they was able to give her some pain medication. And when they did, she was able to go sleep. But at that time, they asked me to leave because I couldn't stay in the hospital because of COVID regulations and so forth, and I had to leave. It was probably 11 o'clock that night. That accident happened. I got the call about 4:20, 4:25 on a Friday afternoon. So 11 o'clock, I had to leave, and I came home. And still in praying and believing that God's going to do a miracle. But when I walked into the house felt so strange and different, like it wasn't my home. It was not home. My wife wasn't here. And I felt very uncomfortable. So I went in one room in the house to make myself comfortable. But I prayed and I cried myself to sleep. I did. I woke up through the night and I prayed again and not knowing what room she was in or anything. And I didn't want to bother her. So I just stayed pacing the floor all night long. This was really one long night with me and God just talking. And I believed that God was going to bring her back. I started having visions of her with the grandkids and vision of her at work and things she had on her calendar she had to do. I was seeing her doing those things. And that blessed me because I knew that if I can see it, it'll make it real. That's the evidence. So that's the evidence of my faith. And I knew that she was going to be here and do those things. So it was just a long night. The next day, which was Saturday, the 12th, visitors was allowed back in at 10 o'clock. So I got up and I was there at 10, and they allowed me to go up to the room at 10 o'clock. When I arrived to the room, my friends, the Mingers, they came down. But when I walked in the room before the Mingers arrived and walked in, I called my wife, Alvita Thompson, my 24-hour miracle. Because what I saw the night in the ED and what I was now looking at was like two different people. The swelling had gone down tremendously. Of course, they had cleaned up the blood on her. She was conscious. She was talking. It was as if she was just sitting in the bed resting. I said, oh my God. This is my 24-hour miracle. God heard my voice. God protected her. And when I looked at her, I just had to just lay on her and just weep and cry because God had done a 24-hour miracle. From the time I left at 11 o'clock Friday night to the time I arrived at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, it was a transformation. that my wife was even beginning to look like herself. Yes, she was still swollen. She had the black eyes. Her eyes was halfway shut and so forth. But she was alive. She was kicking. She was moving. They had taken the back brace off, so her back was okay. They thought she had spinal injuries and so forth. But what happened in the accident was my wife went unconscious, driving home from work, and the car sped up. The lady behind her said she drove through a school zone just fine. She got out of school zone and the car just picked up speed and left the road. She traveled 60 yards in an open field, just bouncing. She hit a brook, came out of the brook, kept on going, and the car went into a wall of trees, a wall of just woods. And it went into the woods at 60 miles an hour. The car traveled 40 yards inside of the woods and struck a tree head on to bring the car to a stop. My wife was in this vehicle for 100 yards, traveling over 60 miles an hour, unconscious, till the car came to a complete stop. So with that, when the Mingers arrived that Saturday, the officer, Dixon, called and said, Mr. Thompson, I took your personal items out of the car and I have them with me here at the station. When he called as if it was a fatality because EMS said that my wife was not going to make it to the trauma center. So when I told him, well, thank you, I'll be about to pick him up. I'm with my wife now. She's doing great. He said, excuse me, how's your wife? I said, she's doing fine. He was in awe because they were treating the accident as a fatality. So when I left the hospital to go see him, they had taken over 500 pictures of the way the car left the road, traveled, the trajectory of the car, in the woods, and pictures of the car and everything else. 500 pictures. So he asked me, was I able to look at these pictures? And I said, God has given me a 24-hour miracle. My wife is doing fine. She's in the hospital. She's up. I said, what I see now, I don't believe. I believe what I left in the hospital. So looking at these pictures wouldn't bother me. And he showed me those pictures. And when I looked at those pictures, I'm just amazed that anyone can travel what she did and that car take that type of a beating when it drove those 40 yards into the woods and made that impact into the car, that anyone can survive that. So after I saw those pictures, it just had me to have another level of faith and just how great and mighty God is. Because if out of my intelligence, there's no way anyone could have survived that. So when we left the sheriff officers, when I got my wife's purse, Hira Mingra and myself, we drove back to see the vehicle. But they wouldn't allow us to touch the car because the car was on hold because it was under investigation because it was supposedly a fatality. So I took pictures of the car, but I was unable to touch the car. So we went back to the hospital because April Minger stayed with my wife and she was praying with her and holding her hand and just comforting her, and and they would just talk about the glory of God while Hira and myself was with the sheriff and going to see the car. So it was a beautiful day, how my wife began to recover so fast. And the next day, the doctor came in and said that, we can go ahead and release you. Gave her some orders and things she can and cannot do. So I was able to bring her home on Sunday and brought her home and made her very comfortable. And things began to go well. And she was, of course, still in pain and still wearing the back brace and so forth. But we made her comfortable and she began to be restored. A week later, I went back once they released the car. The following Saturday, I went back to the car to get the personal items out of the car because it was released from the investigation and things of that sort. And when I actually walked up on the car, which I could not do a week before, and looked at the car, it was amazing because when she struck the tree, when she was going through the woods, the front tire came off the car, the front axle broke and came off, and it caused the car to turn and shift. She was headed directly for the tree to hit on the driver's side, but because the wheel came off, the car turned and she struck the tree at 60 miles an hour, just slightly to the right of the center of the car. The tree came through the car all the way to the passenger seat. That side of the car was gone. I couldn't even find the motor in the car due to the impact on the car. And when I looked in the car, the dashboard was completely gone. All the airbags had exploded. I can see where her head had struck the windshield, but I can see the branches outside the car that struck the windshield too. So the windshield was beaten on both sides of the car. The rear seat, the rear seat dislodged from the back of the car, and the armrest off the rear seat was on the front floorboard. The rear window on the car shattered into a million pieces, and the car was covered with glass all over the car. The front passenger seat dislodged from the floor, just to show you the impact behind that. But when I looked at that and I saw blood in the back seat, I saw blood on the back floorboard, I saw blood on the dashboard, I saw blood on the front seat, there was blood on the passenger seat. In my mind, I looked and said, my wife had gone through something that only God could have protected her, though she left from only the impact on her head and no cuts and bruises or broken bones anywhere in her body. That had to be God. So I give God all the praise and honor for what he did. This was indeed a 24-hour miracle. My wife can give you the insight of what she went through and the experience. But in my mind, when I picture what she went through and saw the accident, I am in awe of what God has done. But what he did, only my God can do such a thing. And I thank God for that. And he has all my faith, honor, trust in him. And he has been so good to us. So I thank y'all for listening. And wow, I just give God all the glory. I give him all the glory. My faith is increased because of what I've seen. So thank you for listening.